Hello and good evening, everyone. Today I'm speaking to a historian and a journalist, and he's an author of three books that I'm aware of: "The Pearls of Dominance" and "The Imbalance of Power" on the Vietnam War, and the latest book is called "CIA's Insider's Guide to Iran: A Crisis from the Coup to the Brink of War." But the topic today is the second last book that I would like to talk about, which is "The Manufactured Crisis: The Untold Story of Iran's Nuclear Scare." So, Gareth Porter, welcome to this channel.
Thank you so much, Hugo. Very nice to be with you.
Thank you. So, the book that you've written, it's quite information dense. It really challenged my my brain a little bit on Iran and Iranian history. And as my listeners know, I'm married to Iranian women, so I could confirm some of the stuff that you wrote. Um, I want you to give us just a background. What is the origin of Iran's attitude to nuclear weapons, and in particular, highlight the important period of the Iran-Iraq War?
Sure. This is a very important point, absolutely, to understand for those who are unfamiliar with the history of Iran's nuclear program. Really, there was a period, as you point out, of the Iran-Iraq War. This was very first years of the regime, the Islamic regime in Iran, after the Saddam Hussein regime had attacked Iran, and the issue of how Iran would respond to that attack in terms of what sort of weapons it would be able to use came up early in the war, as I found out in my own research, because the Iraqis were using weapons of mass destruction. They were using chemical weapons against Iranian targets, initially military targets, but later on against Iranian cities. And tens of thousands of Iranian citizens were severely injured by the Iraqi chemical weapons. So this became very early on, by 1982, it was an issue in terms of the Iranian resistance forces, whether they could and should respond by developing their own chemical weapons and possibly even nuclear weapons. And I interviewed, this was not in my book, but I interviewed the then head of military supply of the Iranian military forces, who was retired, of course, but still living in the capital. And so I had a chance to interview him about that episode in the history of the Iran-Iraq War. And he told me that he had gone to Ayatollah Khomeini in person, in his official capacity, to propose that he be allowed to develop a nuclear weapons program as well as a chemical weapons program. And Khomeini was very firm on that point. To be clear, he said, absolutely no, this is strictly forbidden in Islam to have weapons of mass destruction. Iran may not have any weapons of mass destruction. So it's out of the question. And so he basically went ahead with the war effort for several more years, until then, in the late period of the war, around 1986, 87, as I said, the Iraqis began to use chemical weapons against civilian targets on cities. And then he went back to Khomeini a second time, and again asked permission to develop. Well, he told him that I'm not so sure that he told him, he certainly didn't tell him the full truth, but he intimated that he was ready to go ahead with a program of chemical weapons. And he was again told absolutely not by Khomeini. And so he actually had begun to gather the rudiments of a chemical weapons program, and he dismantled it and stopped it. So that is really the essential background for understanding the thinking on the part of the Iranian regime, which again, of course, Khomeini was the official who made decisions on all basically major political military decisions for the regime. And that established the principle that Iran could not have nuclear weapons. Now, it came up again after, of course, Khamenei became the leading figure in the regime, the one who makes the decisions about ultimate the ultimate acceptability of decisions in terms of Islamic law. So Khamenei actually was late in doing so. He did not make any decision about this in the early period of the Islamic regime, when he was the ultimate decision maker. But when it came up as a political issue internationally, he felt that he was forced to make a new decision, to make it clear that he, as the ultimate Islamic source of law for Iran, would not allow any nuclear weapons program to be developed. And so that really ended, for all intents and purposes, any possibility that Iran could have a nuclear weapons program under his jurisdiction.
Okay, so just to give the listeners an impression here, which I think is important, because I've visited Iran once and I'm going again. If you travel through any Iranian city or town, the memories of the Iran-Iraq war is real. So it is, the best I can describe it is the equivalent of the Second World War in Russia, or even in America for that matter. It is a foundational, narrative shaping war, if you will, of the Iranian Republic. So decisions made on that basis is usually, in a sense, it's final in Iran. And the second point I think that I would like you to elaborate on is, Iran is ruled by the Velayet-i Faiq, the Faiq being the supreme leader. Now, you make the point that the supreme leader made the decision that there will not be chemical and nuclear weapons. Now, the critics against that argument have said, but people in the regime can undermine it, that fatwa has not been codified in law. So how do you respond to that?
Well, there have been an awful lot of arguments made by those who are intent on the idea that Iran must have had nuclear weapons, must have developed nuclear weapons. And these treatments of the concept of the fatwa in Iranian Islamic law are extremely far off the mark. And in my book, I quote a PhD candidate in the UK who has done, up to that point, at least in my knowledge, the most detailed research on this whole question. And he pointed out that the arguments that had been made simply they had no understanding of the concept of fatwa. For one thing, the argument has been made, I won't go into all the arguments, but I think the biggest single argument has been that it has to be a document that can be read, online, that there's a place where you would find something that's a fatwa. And this student in the UK pointed out to me that that's not necessary. It could be a speech by the supreme leader. It could be remarks made informally in a group. It can take a number of different forms. So essentially, what I want to just emphasize is that the fatwa against nuclear weapons has been widely misconstrued, misrepresented. And even the Washington Post fact finder, the fact checker, I should say, wrote a column about the fatwa, which I responded to in detail and pointed out the extreme errors that he had made, showing that he had not really done the necessary research to write that column. But basically, I'm really quite confident that it is safe to say that the fatwa was valid. It was understood as valid within the regime and by everybody who followed Islam within Iran.
Okay, and that's I think an important point for anyone who's interested in the issue to take very high note of, is that there is a fatwa. And just for clarity, is that fatwa still active today?
It is still active today. It has not been removed or has not been changed. Now the question arises, if and when the current supreme leader should die, will the fatwa still be valid? I think there are different views on that. It's very likely that at that point, a new supreme leader would be called upon to make some remarks about the question. It's difficult to believe that that would not happen. And therefore, it seems quite likely that in any case, the successor to the present supreme leader will issue in effect, a fatwa to this effect.
Okay, that's fair enough. Now, anyone listening to this is shocking news would ask the question, then how did we get to the point where we now have a crisis where Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon?
I'm sorry, would you repeat that?
How do we get to a point now in the media discourse where there's a narrative saying that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon?
I'm sorry, okay, I missed the word narrative. Now I heard it. Yes, there's a long history about this narrative, of course, going back many years, which is the result of a very decided and continuing propaganda campaign by the US government to make it beyond any question on the part of readers of newspapers and watchers of television news that, of course, we know that Iran has a nuclear weapons program. And without going into detail about this, I mean, I think that it really began during the early history of Iran's nuclear program, when the United States made a major political diplomatic effort to muscle its own allies, particularly France and Germany, to force them to try to force an end to the Iranian nuclear program. This would have been in the early 1980s. And that's because the Iranians had made a decision that they would not try to enrich uranium themselves. They would continue to use the same arrangement that the Shah had had, which was to rely on a consortium located in France that would do all of the enrichment of uranium. And that meant that they would not control it, that they would only be able to take advantage of what was done by that France-based consortium. And so what the United States tried to do was to get the French in particular and the Germans, who were also helping Iran's nuclear program in various technical ways, because of the need to repair the one remaining nuclear reactor in Iran. The Germans were helping them do that. So the United States tried to force both France and Germany to end their cooperation with Iran, in the belief that that would force an end to the program. And neither Germany nor France was happy with that, but they were responsive to American pressure. And so that is why the Iranians, in effect, made the decision to have their own nuclear weapons program, their own nuclear program. And that meant going to the market to purchase the fundamental technology that was necessary to carry out their own program without any international support. And that's a chapter in this whole history that is completely unknown to the public, because simply has been covered up by media and by the U.S. government. They don't want to deal with that for obvious reasons.
A question on that, which is an important question to highlight here, was that in violation or in respect of the International Atomic Energy Agency treaties, of non-proliferation treaties?
The Non-Proliferation Treaty. That is a very important point, important question. And the answer, of course, is that it is totally consistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Every member of the IAEA has the absolute right to have its own nuclear program. I mean, this is a right that is part of the charter of the IAEA. So the United States was really violating that charter, doing violence to the charter in its effort to put pressure on Iran and on the France and Germany, which were at that point before the Iranians were forced to get their own technology. They were helping them. And again, this is something that has never been recognized. It's been simply, it's under the rug as far as the U.S. public and media are concerned.
Okay, well, that's just important question. So you would say in no point until, let's say, 2003, we can now elaborate maybe for afterwards, was Iran violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty?
Yeah, there's been no violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and at that point, it became a question of the United States essentially basically saying that had evidence that Iran was starting its own nuclear weapons program, which would violate it would be a violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, obviously.
Okay.
So that's why my book is devoted to a great extent to the history of how the Iranians dealt with these accusations by the United States and by its allies, its European allies, essentially, by responding quite fully to every question that was raised. And in my book, I have a chapter in which it deals with each of the questions separately and how the Iranians provided documentation that should have satisfied the United States. The United States' response to that was essentially to pay no attention to it. They simply didn't deal with it. They pretended it never happened, which is obviously very revealing in terms of the legitimacy of the U.S. case.
Not very surprising to somebody that's not from the Western world, if I can put it that way. Question then on this. So, okay, let's sort of fast forward because, for the sake of time, the current claim that Iran has a nuclear weapons program was handed to German intelligence by the MEK. As I understand your book, the MEK, for those who don't know, is a Mujahideen Khalq. They are here based in Paris, where I am. They are a fanatical cult, basically. You should just look at them on the internet and you'll see they're nuts. Okay, so was this source legitimate? Let me ask you that straight.
Right. I mean, this is obviously evidence that should have upset the entire apple cart in terms of the U.S. case against Iran on its nuclear program. And I document in my book the way in which this is documented came from the German official who was in charge of relations with North America and who was brought into the details of the issue because the German officials who were in charge of this issue of nuclear affairs asked him to come in because they were upset that the Secretary of State under the Bush administration was making public statements suggesting that Iran was in fact violating the IAEA and was getting into a nuclear weapons program, that they had evidence of that. and that he was told by the German officials in charge of the issue that they knew for a fact that that was not the case, and that there was no evidence whatsoever of a violation. And he actually wrote a Wall Street Journal editorial op-ed piece saying that, which again has been sort of wiped out of the history of this. No one's ever paid any attention to it except for my book. And he retired in, if I remember correctly, 2013 or 2014. And I had an opportunity to do a telephone interview with him in which he gave me this detailed background. And then, of course, the roof caved in on him. He was under very big pressure from the German government not to say a word about this. And he would give no more interviews to anybody else and wouldn't talk to me again at all. He was very unhappy that this had happened, apparently. But anyway, I have my notes on the interview, and there's no doubt that he said explicitly, he gave the explicit history of that affair.
In an article you wrote to The Nation in 2014, you drew a comparison between this type of intelligence, or lack of intelligence, I'll call it that, and the Iraqi, the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. I mean, is this that significant?
Yeah, I mean, this is of the same character in terms of an issue where the U.S. government went completely off the rails in terms of its claims, and the U.S. intelligence community was very deeply involved in that in both cases, and that's another major sort of parallel between the two cases. Indeed, I tried to take advantage of that in my book to suggest that this is a major bumbling of the U.S. intelligence community, comparable to the one that accompanied the charge that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, that he was using weapons of mass destruction. So it is a complete flop, a failure of U.S. intelligence. And, I interviewed the guy who was in charge of the 2007 estimate, a CIA estimate, which made the call that Iran had in fact entered into a weapons of mass destruction program in 2003. Had at that point had a weapons of mass destruction program, and I questioned him very closely about it. And at one point, the question I was asking, he refused to answer. So I think that he has some inkling that there was some weaknesses in that case, but he's not going to admit that.
Okay, now the other elephant in the room here is Israel. What is Israeli role in this whole story?
Right. I mean, there's no doubt that the Israelis were behind the MEKs having those fake documents. These were documents that the MEK was not capable of manufacturing. It was an Israeli Mossad affair. They were the ones who had actually manufactured a set of documents which, if you look at it closely, knowing the history of the Iranian nuclear program, you can really make a hard and fast case that these had to be fake documents. I can go into it in detail, but it would take some time. So I think the point here is that the Israelis in 2000, from 2004 to 2006, were involved in compiling a set of documents that they could use basically to get the United States government to take up the cudgel on their behalf and accuse Iran of having a nuclear weapons program. And ever since then, of course, they have been continuing to carry out a disinformation program about this whole question, this whole issue of Iran's nuclear program and its supposed continuing becoming involved in nuclear weapons. And they did it again a few years ago when they came out with another set of documents, which they made a huge propaganda program around. Netanyahu appeared with a set of notebooks behind him lined up on shelves, making this claim. And again, I revealed in a series of articles how the Israeli Mossad did another job of creating false documents in order to make this case. And nobody has challenged anything that I wrote and published about this.
Has there been any documents since this MEK documents that comes from legitimate sources to demonstrate that Iran has a nuclear weapons program?
No, nothing. I mean, those people who visited Israel and have been shown these documents have never been given a chance to take them home with them. Mossad and Netanyahu have been very careful not to allow any foreigner who would have the potential to do a job of actually fact-checking would have access to the original documents, or even facsimiles of them. And so, I mean, they've been given a few documents, selected documents, but not the entire set of documents. It's clear that they did not want to take any chances.
Okay, so then what do you make of two things that happened? First, there is now a media statement that Iran has 84% enrichment, although no context of grams or quantities are ever cited, which makes me skeptical as an engineer in the field. And the second question is, Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, recently said that Iran has not yet decided to resume a nuclear weapon. Now, those two statements seem contradictory. What do you make of it?
Yes, I understand what you're talking about. There are two different stories about this question with different headlines. One headline said, Iran confirms the accusation. I think the term accusation was used against Iran over the nuclear weapons program. The second one said Iran challenges or denies that accusation. And what actually happened was that one of the stories was basically saying that Iran agreed that they had been accused of having this violation of 84%, not admitting it, but admitting that they'd been accused of it by somebody in IAEA. The other story said they were denying the accusation. So it was a problem of lack of clarity on the part of the headline writers in particular about these stories.
Okay, so that's I'll ask you this question then. Obama had this nuclear deal that Trump walked out of. Okay, and it would seem to me, after reading your book, and I wish I read it before I actually met my wife, it would have made my trip to Iran much easier, that there never was a crisis to begin with. So does that not put to question this entire nuclear deal and everything that followed from them?
Yeah, I mean, there should not have been any crisis either before or after the nuclear deal, but particularly now focusing on the fact that there was a deal that the United States signed that would have essentially dealt with all the problems the United States was raising. And then Trump, of course, in his wisdom, quote unquote, big quote marks around that, essentially got out of it, refused to have anything to do with it. And that left his successor with a decision about how to handle this. And not surprisingly, the new Democratic administration, the Biden administration, has handled it by essentially punting and not really making an immediate decision and sort of putting it off and leaving it up, putting the onus on Iran to come around and deal with them in a way that they find acceptable. So basically, it's a crisis waiting to happen in the future, is the way I would put it.
Okay, so what is the possibility of war breaking out? Because on the one hand, you have the CIA director saying Iran doesn't have plans to resume nuclear weaponization, and then there was some statement, I can't remember if it was your Congress or your Senate, where somebody testified and said Iran is 12 days from a bomb. Again, you have these two stories. So what is the possibility of war coming out of this nonsense?
Well, as an investigative journalist, it's in my interest to say, oh yeah, there's a serious threat of war here. But as a historian and as somebody who doesn't want to tell a lie, I have to say that I don't really believe that the chances of war are significant at all. And that's based on the fact that we've had a succession of war crises for 15 years now, more than 15 years, closer to 20 years now. And the Israelis were the ones behind that for many years. For their own purposes, they wanted the world to believe that unless something was done about the Iranian nuclear program to force an end to it, they would do something about it militarily. And in my book, I talk about these war crises that Netanyahu deliberately created for that political purpose. But in fact, he never had any intention of having a war against Iran. And indeed, it would have been really impossible for Israel to do it itself. It would have to have the United States okay. It would need American support to carry a war out. It really didn't have the full capability to do it by itself. For one thing, at least at the very beginning, the early period of this, the Israelis did not have the refueling capability they needed to carry out a two-way operation against Iran. And I think that politically, they would have difficulty doing this without US support. And that's one of the things that I learned from my own trip to Israel to do the research for this book, that really Netanyahu was much more cautious than he would ever let on publicly. I mean, his pose was that he was the man who was going to save Israel and that he was not going to allow the Iranians to do this. But in fact, he was relying on American support all the way. And when the Americans said no, when the Obama administration refused to play ball with him, he really didn't have an answer to that.
So would you say then it is Israeli tactics as a strategy basically to keep the hype of Iran alive?
Exactly. Yeah. That's a political strategy, not a military intention.
Okay, that's fair enough. Well, Gareth, I'd like to thank you very much for this information, and please do. This is a very important book to anyone who cares about the Iranian issue. I think I'm actually ashamed that I only discovered it recently. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for your interest in it. I'm glad to have somebody who does in fact have that serious interest. That's always great to know.
Thank you very much.